hunter saved dying pregnant bear. A year later, he heard a cry that brought him to tears. The first snowfall came early to the bitter mountains that year, dusting the pines with white in late October when the leaves still clung to some of the hardwoods. Hank Dawson stood on the porch of his cabin, watching his breath fog in the crisp morning air as he sipped coffee from a chipped enamel mug. The mountains rose jagged against the pale sky, their peaks already snow-capped and gleaming in the dawn light. At 50, the cold bothered his joints more than it used to, particularly the knee he'd shattered during his second tour in Afghanistan. 20 years had passed since he traded the chaos of war for the quiet rhythms of Montana's wilderness. His cabin sat in a small clearing near Clearwater Lake, miles from the nearest neighbor. He'd built it himself, log by log, during that first hard summer after leaving the military. The physical labor had been a balm for his fractured mind, each swing of the axe working out another piece of the horror he'd carried home. His gaze swept across the treeline, assessing the weather. The heavy cloud cover promised more snow before nightfall, and he needed to check his traps and gather more firewood. He drained his coffee, set the mug on the rough-hewn railing, and stepped back inside. The cabin was Spartan but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its embers still glowing from the night before. A worn leather armchair faced the fire, a stack of dog-eared books on the floor beside it. His bed occupied one corner, covered with thick wool blankets. The kitchen was little more than a wood stove, a sink with a hand pump, and a pine table he'd made himself. Hank pulled on his heavy coat, lined with sheepskin that had seen better days, and secured his fur-lined hat with the ear flaps that local ranchers mocked but which had saved his ears from frostbite more than once. He slipped his hunting knife into its sheath, checked that his rifle was loaded, and stepped outside into the silence of the mountains. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he made his way through the forest. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent decades navigating these woods, stopping occasionally to reset a trap or collect kindling for his fire. Winter in the bitter meant temperatures that routinely dropped to 20 below zero, and survival depended on preparation and respect for nature's power. By mid-morning, Hank had collected a few rabbits from his traps and had strapped a bundle of firewood to his back. He was making his way along the ridge above his cabin when a set of tracks in the fresh snow caught his eye. He crouched down, his gloved fingers hovering over the distinct paw print of a black bear, female, from the size of it, and moving with what appeared to be an irregular gait. One track pressed deeper than the others, suggesting an injury or limp. Curiosity piqued, Hank followed the trail. In 20 years, he'd encountered plenty of bears, keeping a respectful distance as they went about their business. This one seemed to be moving slowly, purposefully, but with difficulty. The tracks led him toward a dense stand of pines that offered shelter from the wind. He smelled her before he saw her, the musky, wild scent of bear. Crouching behind a fallen log, Hank peered through the branches and spotted her, a young female black bear, her coat glossy in patches but matted with ice in others. Most notable was a streak of lighter fur running down her back, pale as the trunk of an old willow tree. Her belly hung heavy, swollen with pregnancy, and she moved with visible discomfort, favoring her right hind leg. "Well now," Hank whispered to himself. "You're in a tough spot, aren't you, girl?" The bear, Willow, he found himself naming her immediately, limped to the base of a large pine and collapsed, her breathing labored, her eyes dull with exhaustion. Even from a distance, Hank could see the wound on her leg, not deep, but enough to hamper her movement. Around her, the snow was stained with droplets of blood, both hers and something else's. Staying downwind, Hank circled the area, reading the story written in the snow. Another set of tracks, larger than Willow's, told of a territorial dispute. An older female bear had claimed this area, and the claw marks on nearby trees, along with tufts of black fur snagged on the bark, spoke of a fierce fight. Willow had been driven out, wounded and pregnant, with no den for the winter. Overhead, the sky darkened with the promise of a heavy snowfall. Hank glanced back at Willow, who had closed her eyes, her sides heaving with each breath. Without a proper den and in her weakened state, she and her unborn cubs wouldn't survive the coming storm. 20 years of solitude had not hardened Hank's heart as much as he sometimes pretended. He stood for a long moment, weighing his options. The smart choice was to leave her to nature's course. Bears were wild animals, dangerous even when weakened, and interfering went against everything he believed about respecting the natural order. And yet, damn it all, he muttered, making his decision. For the next few hours, Hank worked at a careful distance, constructing a makeshift den. He found a natural depression beneath a rock outcropping, deep enough to provide shelter but not so tight that Willow would feel trapped. He reinforced it with fallen logs, creating a wind barrier, and gathered armfuls of pine needles, moss, and dry grass for insulation. The work warmed him despite the falling temperature, and by late afternoon he had created a serviceable shelter. From his pack, he took the rabbits he'd trapped, gutting them quickly and placing them near the entrance to the den, along with a handful of dried berries from his own winter stores and a small jar of honey he had been saving for a special occasion. He backed away, moving in a wide arc to avoid leaving his scent too close to the den. "It's not much," he said to the exhausted bear, "but it might get you through tonight." He returned to his cabin as the first heavy snowflakes began to fall, his mind troubled by what he'd done. Interfering with wildlife went against everything he believed, everything he'd practiced in his years in the wilderness. But something about Willow's plight had stirred a compassion he thought long buried beneath the scar tissue of war and isolation. The storm raged through the night, howling around the eaves of his cabin. Hank lay awake, listening to the wind and wondering if the shelter he'd built would hold. At first light, he bundled up against the cold and made his way back to the den site, half expecting to find it empty or collapsed. Instead, he found Willow inside the shelter, curled against the far wall. The food was gone, and fresh tracks in the new snow showed she had dragged herself into the makeshift den sometime during the night. Her dark eyes watched him warily from the shadows, but she made no move to flee or attack. "Well, look at that," Hank said softly. "Seems we understand each other." In the days that followed, a routine emerged. Each morning, Hank would visit the den, bringing what food he could spare, fish from the lake, more dried berries, once even a portion of the venison he had been saving. He never approached too closely, always leaving the offerings near the entrance and retreating to observe from a distance. Gradually, Willow's weariness seemed to ease, though she remained cautious, as any wild creature should. The wound on her leg began to heal, and her movements became less labored. She would emerge from the den when he approached, watching him with what Hank fancied was recognition, though he knew better than to anthropomorphize a wild bear. Still, there was something in her gaze that spoke of intelligence, of assessment, of a begrudging acceptance of his presence, of her hero. December brought colder temperatures and deeper snow. Hank reinforced the den repeatedly, adding layers of insulation and ensuring the entrance remained accessible. As drifts piled higher, he cleared a path from the den to a nearby stream, making it easier for Willow to reach water. The work gave him purpose beyond mere survival, something he hadn't felt in years. One night in mid-December, a particularly violent storm swept through the mountains. The wind screamed through the trees with such force that Hank could hear branches snapping even over the roar. Sometime after midnight, a particularly loud crash jerked him from an uneasy sleep. He lay still, listening, and then heard it, a pained roar echoing across the distance. Willow. Without hesitation, Hank dressed and plunged into the storm. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet, and the snow was so thick he could barely see the beam of his flashlight. He fought his way toward the den, the cold biting through his layers as if they were nothing more than paper. When he reached the site, his stomach dropped. A mass of pine had been uprooted by the wind, crashing down perilously close to the den entrance. Part of the shelter had collapsed, and snow was rapidly filling the opening. Hank could hear Willow inside, her distressed sounds driving him to action. Working frantically, he used a small folding shovel to clear the snow from the entrance. Then, bracing himself against the gale, he began to drag away the smaller branches of the fallen tree. His hands grew numb despite his gloves, and sweat froze on his brow, but he continued, determined to prevent the den from being completely buried. "Hold on, girl," he shouted over the wind, though he doubted she could understand his words. "I'm not letting you get trapped in there." He worked for what felt like hours, using all his strength to move what debris he could and shore up the damaged section of the den with fresh logs and stones. The wind howled around him, driving snow into his face and down his collar, but he refused to leave until the shelter was secure again. In his exhaustion, in the blinding snow, Hank didn't notice the ice-slicked boulder until it was too late. His foot slipped and he went down hard, a sharp pain lancing through his ankle. Worse, as he fell, a broken branch from the fallen tree came down with him, pinning him beneath its weight. He struggled to free himself, but the combination of the deep snow, his injured ankle, and the weight of the branch left him trapped. The irony wasn't lost on him. After years of careful survival in one of the most unforgiving environments in America, he was about to freeze to death trying to save a wild bear. The cold began to seep into his bones, and exhaustion pulled at him. He knew that if he lost consciousness, he would never wake up. Through the driving snow, he barely registered the dark shape emerging from the den. Willow approached cautiously, her nose working to catch his scent through the storm. Hank went still, suddenly aware of his vulnerability. If she perceived him as a threat now, in her den during a crisis, her natural instincts might override the tentative trust they'd established. "Easy, Willow," he murmured, though his voice was lost in the wind. The bear circled him once, twice, her movements surprisingly graceful despite her pregnancy and healing wound. Then, to Hank's astonishment, she began to dig at the snow around him, her powerful claws moving aside the drifts that trapped him. When she reached the branch across his legs, she gripped it in her jaws and, with a strength that left Hank breathless, pulled it free. Released from the weight, Hank managed to drag himself toward a small overhang of rock nearby. His ankle throbbed, and he knew he couldn't make it back to his cabin in the storm. With fingers stiff from cold, he gathered what dry moss and kindling he could find beneath the overhang and, using the waterproof matches he always carried, managed to start a small fire. The last thing he remembered before exhaustion claimed him was the dark shape of Willow retreating back to her den, her tracks already filling with fresh snow. Morning brought clarity and pain. Hank awoke beside the smoldering remains of his fire, his ankle swollen and every muscle aching from cold and exertion. Around him, the snow was marked with bear tracks, clear evidence that his encounter with Willow hadn't been a dream or a hallucination brought on by hypothermia. He limped back to his cabin, fashioned a crude splint for his ankle, and spent the next few days recovering. As soon as he could walk without intense pain, he returned to the den, half expecting to find Willow gone. Instead, he found her watching for him, emerging from the repaired den at his approach. There was something different in her manner now, a recognition that went beyond mere familiarity. In saving each other, they had formed a bond that transcended the natural boundaries between human and wild. The winter deepened, temperatures plummeting to 20 below zero and beyond. Hank continued his daily visits, and Willow continued to accept his presence. In late January, she stopped emerging from the den altogether, and Hank knew her time had come. He left food at the entrance and kept his distance, respecting the privacy of this most natural and vulnerable of moments. 3 days later, when he approached the den, he heard the unmistakable sounds of tiny cubs. Using his binoculars from a respectful distance, he caught glimpses of 2 small forms nestled against their mother's dark fur. Something tightened in his chest at the sight, pride, perhaps, or a sense of wonder that he had played some small part in ensuring these new lives came safely into the world. "Well done, Willow," he whispered, a rare smile creasing his weathered face. "Well done, indeed." February brought fresh challenges. Hank noticed unfamiliar tracks in the snow around the den site, human tracks. Hunters sometimes ventured this far into the wilderness, though it was unusual in the dead of winter. Following the tracks, he discovered something that sent a chill through him, colder than any Montana wind. Tied to a branch near the den, a red ribbon fluttered in the breeze, a marker used by poachers to identify a target for later hunting. Examining the area more carefully, Hank found cigarette butts and the remains of a small fire. The poachers had discovered Willow's den and marked it, planning to return for the bear and her cubs. Anger, hot and unfamiliar after years of emotional distance, surged through Hank. The poachers had no way of knowing that the female bear they'd marked had cubs. Killing her would doom the young ones as well. Even if that hadn't been the case, the thought of Willow's life ending at the hands of men who killed for profit rather than sustenance filled him with rage. Back at his cabin, Hank paced the floor, his mind racing. Direct confrontation was risky. Poachers were often desperate men, armed and dangerous. Reporting them wasn't an option. The nearest ranger station was miles away, and he had no means of communication. If he wanted to save Willow and her cubs, he would need to rely on the skills he'd honed both in war and in the wilderness. A plan began to form. That night, under the cover of darkness, Hank returned to the den. Working silently, he used pine branches to sweep away all traces of bear tracks in the vicinity. Then, using an old trick he'd learned from a Blackfeet elder years ago, he created a false trail. From a shed in his cabin, he'd retrieved a crude tool, a bear paw from an animal that had died years before, stuffed and preserved, mounted on a handle. With this, he carefully created a line of tracks leading away from the real den toward a dangerous ravine where no bear would actually den. The false trail had to look natural, with irregular spacing and the occasional mark of a cub, which he simulated with smaller prints pressed into the snow with his fist. He worked meticulously, backtracking and covering his own footprints, ensuring that to the untrained eye, it would appear that the bear family had relocated. Satisfied with the false trail, Hank implemented the second part of his plan. On a rocky ledge visible from the poacher's camp, but well away from Willow's actual location, he built a small smoky fire using green wood and damp moss. Near it, he planted a wooden stake with a strip of red cloth, similar enough to the markers used by forest rangers to make poachers nervous. The message was clear to anyone who knew the woods. Authorities were nearby, patrolling for men engaged in illegal hunting. It was a warning to stay away. Hank spent a cold, uncomfortable night hidden in the trees, watching and waiting. Shortly after dawn, his vigilance was rewarded. Two men in camouflage approached the area, rifles slung over their shoulders. They discovered the missing marker first, confusion evident in their body language. Then, finding the false trail, they followed it toward the ravine, their voices carrying in the clear morning air. "Bear must have moved on," one said. "Yeah, and look at that smoke up there," the other replied, pointing toward Hank's decoy fire. "Ranger patrol, you think?" "Could be. Someone might have reported shots from this area. I don't like it. Too risky. Let's get out of here before they spot us." The men retreated, their footsteps hasty in the snow. Hank waited until they were well away before allowing himself a grim smile of satisfaction. The ruse had worked. Willow and her cubs were safe, at least for now. As February gave way to March, the iron grip of winter began to loosen its hold on the mountains. The days grew longer, the sun stronger, though nights remained bitterly cold. Hank continued his daily visits to the den, watching from a distance as the cubs grew stronger. They ventured to the entrance occasionally now, their curiosity evident even from afar as they tumbled over each other in brief play before retreating to the warmth and safety of their mother's side. Hank found himself talking to them sometimes, his voice rusty from disuse. He told them about the mountains in spring, about the wildflowers that would carpet the meadows and the streams that would run full with snowmelt. He described the taste of fresh huckleberries and the feeling of summer sun on fur. It was foolishness, he knew, to speak to wild animals as if they could understand, and yet, it eased something in him that had been tight for decades. "You'll be leaving soon," he told Willow one clear morning in late March. "That's as it should be. You don't belong to me or this place. You belong to yourself, in the mountains." The bear watched him with those intelligent eyes, her cubs now venturing farther from the den entrance, growing bolder as their strength increased. One of them, slightly larger than its sibling, had inherited Willow's distinctive streak of lighter fur. Hank had privately named this one Yupin, for the pale bark of those trees that dotted the mountainsides. The smaller cub, with a perfect white diamond on its chest, he called Star. Names were dangerous things to give wild creatures, they implied ownership, attachment. Hank knew better, and yet he couldn't help himself. These bears had become more than just animals he was helping to survive. They had become companions of a sort, breaking the solitude that had defined his existence for so long. April arrived with the sudden glory that only those who have endured a mountain winter can truly appreciate. The snow began to recede, revealing patches of earth that had lain hidden for months. The first green shoots pushed through the soil, and birds returned to the trees, their songs filling the air after the long silence. Of winter, Hank knew that bears typically emerged from hibernation as spring progressed, and he watched for signs that Willow was preparing to leave. She ventured farther from the den each day, teaching her cubs to forage for the early spring growth. He reduced his visits, gradually withdrawing the food he had provided throughout the winter. It was time for the bears to return fully to the wild, to learn to survive without his intervention. One morning in mid-April, Hank approached the den and found it empty. Panic seized him briefly before reasoned itself. This was natural, expected. Bears didn't say goodbye, they simply moved on when the time was right. Still, he found himself scanning the trees, hoping for a glimpse of the dark shapes that had become so familiar. The forest remained still, offering no sign of Willow or her cubs. Hank stood for a long moment, an unfamiliar emptiness spreading in his chest. Then, with a nod of acceptance, he turned and made his way back to his cabin. Spring flowed into summer, and Hank returned to the rhythms of his solitary life. He fished the stream swollen with snowmelt, tended the small garden behind his cabin, and prepared for the next winter as he always had. Occasionally, he would find bear signs in the woods, a turned-over log where insects had been sought, claw marks on a tree, or tracks along the muddy edge of the lake, and he would wonder if they belonged to Willow and her growing cubs. He told himself it didn't matter. Wild things lived wild lives, separate from human concern or interference. He had done what compassion demanded in a moment of need, nothing more. That the experience had changed something in him, had perhaps healed some small part of the wounds he had carried from war and loss, was incidental. What mattered was that the bears were where they belonged, free in the wilderness that was their home. Summer's heat gave way to the crisp clarity of autumn. The aspen trees turned gold, their leaves trembling in the increasingly cold wind. Berries ripened and fell, providing a feast for the wildlife preparing for winter's return. Hank split wood for his fire, smoked fish and meat for his larder, and harvested the last of his garden before the first frost. It was on such a day, with the scent of wood smoke hanging in the air and the mountains ablaze with fall color, that Hank looked up from his chopping to find himself watched. At the edge of the forest, just beyond the clearing where his cabin stood, 3 black bears stood in silence. Willow had grown sleek and strong, her wound long healed, her coat glossy in the autumn sun. Beside her stood her cubs, no longer the tiny, helpless creatures of winter, but adolescents nearly as large as their mother. Aspen's pale streak was more pronounced now, running like a river of light down his dark back. Star's white diamond had faded somewhat but remained visible against her black fur. They made no sound, no movement toward him. They simply stood watching, as if taking the measure of this human who had intervened in their lives. Hank lowered his axe slowly, straightening to his full height. "Well," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite name, "look at you 3, doing just fine, aren't you?" For a long moment the tableau held, man and bears, regarding each other across the divide between their worlds. Then, with a subtle movement that might have been enough, or simply a shift of her massive head, Willow turned away. Her cubs followed, the 3 black shapes moving with fluid grace between the trees until the forest swallowed them from sight. Hank remained motionless, a strange warmth spreading through him despite the chill in the air. He recognized it finally for what it was, gratitude. Not just his, for the wild beauty of these creatures and the privilege of having helped them, but theirs as well. It had been a farewell of sorts, an acknowledgement of the bond formed during that desperate winter. The tears that slipped down his weathered cheeks surprised him. He hadn't cried since burying his last friend from the war more than 15 years ago. He had thought that part of him dead, calcified by solitude and the harsh realities of survival. Yet here it was, flowing freely in response to a silent exchange, an exchange with creatures who could never understand the complexity of human emotion. Or perhaps they understood more than he gave them credit for. Perhaps gratitude, like fear or hunger or the love of a mother for her young, transcended the boundaries between species. Perhaps it required no words, no rational thought, only the recognition of a life spared, of kindness given without expectation of return. Winter returned to the Bitterroot Mountains as it always did, implacable and severe. Snow fell, temperatures dropped, and the world narrowed once again to the essentials of survival. Hank's days took on the familiar pattern: chopping wood, checking traps, reading by firelight in the long evenings. Sometimes he found himself glancing toward the forest, half expecting to see dark shapes at its edge. They never came, and he told himself he was content with that. The seasons turned as they always had and always would: spring, summer, to autumn, and then winter again, each bringing its own challenges and rewards. Hank marked another year of solitude, of peace found in the rhythms of the natural world. It was a cold afternoon in December, exactly a year after he had first encountered Willow, that Hank heard it, a soft huffing sound from the direction of the trees. He straightened from his wood chopping, breath catching in his throat, as three familiar shapes emerged from the forest. Willow's coat gleamed in the winter sun, thick and healthy. Her cubs, no longer cubs, but young adults, flanked her, their growth in the intervening year remarkable. They stood at the precise edge of the clearing, neither advancing nor retreating, their eyes fixed on the man who had once saved their mother. Time seemed to stop as Hank met that steady gaze. In Willow's eyes, he saw neither the wariness of a wild thing nor the dependency of a tamed one. He saw recognition, acknowledgement, one survivor recognizing another across the divide of species. The moment stretched, heavy with meaning that required no words. Then, with the same subtle movement as before, that almost nod that might have been imagination or might have been communication, Willow turned away. Her offspring followed, the three bears melting into the darkness of the pines like shadows returning to their source. Tears tracked freely down Hank's face, freezing on his beard in the bitter cold. These were not tears of sadness or loss, but of something rarer and more profound: the recognition that between humans and nature there exists the possibility of connection that transcends the need for words or touch. A connection forged in moments of need, sustained by mutual respect, and honored in the freedom to remain true to one's nature. Hank looked up at the vast Montana sky, endless above the jagged peaks of the mountains that had become his home. "Go, Willow," he whispered, his words carried away by the wind, "wild and free as you were always meant to be." In the silence that followed, Hank felt a peace he had sought but never fully found in his 20 years of solitude. It had taken a wounded bear and her cubs to teach him that isolation was not the same as independence, that compassion was not weakness, but strength. In helping Willow survive, he had found something he thought lost to him forever: the capacity to care, to connect, to recognize himself in another living being. As he turned back to his cabin, the mountains loomed around him, ancient and indifferent to the brief lives that played out among their slopes. Yet in their vast wilderness, they had made space for a moment of connection between species, a wordless bond that would remain with the old soldier until his final day.